But let's start at the beginning here with your testimony. You were one of the first. I think you were the first witness.
I was the first witness. Yes.
Yeah, in this case. So why don't you give us an overview of what happened when you were called to the stand?
Yeah. So I thought it was odd that they chose me as the first witness because I was only on the board for roughly a year, 10 months. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of people that have more history than I do with the board. And I think they chose me, the New York AG's office chose me to be the first witness because I wrote so much. I mean, I wrote so many emails to the board when I was on there. And then I've written a lot of, analysis since I left the board to try to communicate to the members what's going on here. So since there was such a record of me writing, I think they decided that was a good comprehensive record of things that were occurring on the board. So that was the reason I went first, which was okay with me. I'm glad that's over, and I'm done with that part. So it definitely was an interesting process for sure.
Yeah, I bet. We'll just give people a little bit of an overview for anyone who's coming to this late. This whole situation with the NRA. The accusation is that Wayne LaPierre and other executives at the NRA used the nonprofit's money to fund lavish personal expenses, things like private jet trips and luxury vacations and fancy suits, all sorts of stuff of that nature. And to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. I think it was $64 million was the claim by the Attorney General, Letitia James, who is a Democrat that does have a history of, calling the NRA a domestic terrorist organization. So there is that factor to consider as well. But your role in all of this is that you were a board member for a while there, and during your time on the board, you became concerned with these allegations. The more you looked at them, and then became a critic and opponent of LaPierre and his group of associates that control the NRA. Is that right?
That's correct. I mean, when I first got on the board, when I was actually appointed. Because a board member had resigned over the bankruptcy filing. So I was appointed to replace that person. When I got on the board, I sort of believed what the NRA was saying, which was this is just a political attack by the New York AG's office, which makes total sense. I mean,
and there's some truth to that, right?
And there's truth to that. So I said, okay, that's fine. I can help them put together a pretty good defense. As a business guy, I'm really good with analysis. And but when I started digging into the records, it's very obvious that there's a lot of things wrong here in terms of the money that was being spent and how it was being spent. I think the number that I heard is that they've quantified as around $110 million worth of misused funds or inappropriate expenditures, those kinds of things. In Texas, we would call that theft. But in the courtroom, they call it malfeasance and all these other things. But people were using money for the personal benefit, at least $100 million. And that's not everything. They didn't have time to track everything, but it's a lot of money for sure.
Right. Because the allegation is that this went on for decades, right? This wasn't just a short thing.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, as near as I can tell, there was an SEC filing that happened in 1998, which was a complaint to the SEC regarding the NRA and some of its vendors, which included Ackerman McQueen. So the same kind of problems that we talk about today with the NRA also were being discussed in 1998. That's a long time, of misuse of relationships, conflict of interests with vendors and those kinds of things. So it appears that it's been at least 25, 30 years worth of abuse for sure.
Yeah. And so what did they focus on in your testimony, and what did each side ask you about?
Well, so the New York AG's office, which the lawyers that work at the New York AG's office, I thought were really professional and really good, and I didn't feel like that they had an axe to grind or they had a political agenda, unlike the Letitia James, who's the New York AG, who obviously is very political. These people work in the charities arm of the office. They're just doing their job. And their job is to oversee charities in New York. And so I think that's what they're doing, regardless of the political influence around that. And so they focused on the timeline of when I was on the board, what did I observe? What did I do about that? They were very curious as to how did I respond to that and what did I do, and kind of carried me through that 10 months of time that I was there and all the actions that I took. And so I thought they were a very, very logical, very organized, and very pointed discussion of my time on the board. The other lawyers in the case, keep in mind, there's 4 sets of lawyers here. NRA has lawyers, Wayne LaPierre has lawyers, Woody Phillips has lawyers, and John Frazier has lawyers.
Yeah. And Woody Phillips was the former treasurer, and John Frazier is the current general counsel
secretary. Right. So there's 4 sets of attorneys in the trial, and they all get to ask questions. So the New York AG's office would ask me questions, and then each of those attorneys would also ask me questions. Do you want to discuss what the other attorneys talked about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what was now, in theory here, the NRA is really the NRA members are the victims in this case. That's
Correct.
The argument from the Attorney General's office,
right,
that people like Wayne and Phillips and Frazier defrauded effectively the NRA members by diverting these funds to themselves, or allowing it to happen under their watch, depending on the person involved, right? And there's already been a settlement in this case by Wayne's former chief of staff, Josh Powell, who agreed to, one, never work on a nonprofit board ever, or work as an officer of a nonprofit in New York ever again, and then 2, to actually pay the NRA back $100,000. So in theory, and that's those are some of the requests for LaPierre and Phillips and the lawyer Frazier as well. But in theory, that puts them on opposite sides of the NRA and its lawyers. Right. But in practice, how did that play out in court?
So it's very obvious that the New York AG's office is pursuing the defendants, which are Wayne LaPierre, Woody Phillips, and John Frazier. They're pursuing them for restitution to the NRA. So if they get restitution, if the court awards restitution, that money goes to the NRA, does not go to the New York AG's office in any form. So the NRA is also a victim as it represents the members. So there does seem to be a separation here. The NRA, unlike in the bankruptcy trial where the separation was not as noticeable, it does seem like there's more separation between the NRA and Wayne LaPierre and the management team. I mean, there's much more criticism is coming from the NRA lawyers than occurred before. And so there seems the NRA is starting to represent itself, which is what it should have been doing all along. But now it seems like they're starting to push back against the management team in the trial.
Did you see that in how they approached your questioning you?
A little bit, because the NRA lawyers were trying to ask me questions in order to bolster what the NRA is about and also what they've done, as opposed to the other lawyers really were trying to attack me personally. They were trying to discredit me. The NRA lawyers didn't try to discredit me. They were really trying to get me to support and make positive comments about the NRA and what they had done in order to, supposedly clean up their organization. So it's a little bit different approach on how they questioned me, for sure.